In early September 1992, the eerie silence of the Alaskan bush was broken by a small group of moose hunters. Deep within the remote backcountry of the Alaska Range, along the George Parks Highway and near the Susquehanna River, they stumbled upon Fairbanks Bus 142, a derelict 1940s transit vehicle left behind by a construction crew to serve as a makeshift shelter. Stepping through the rusted door, they were hit by the unmistakable scent of decay. Strung on a makeshift bed of blue denim in the back of the bus was the emaciated body of a young man. At the time of his discovery, he weighed a mere 67 pounds, 30.4 kilograms. Beside his remains lay a camera containing dozens of self-portraits, capturing a gaunt but radiantly smiling youth under the subarctic sun, and a desperate SOS note taped to the bus door. SOS, I need your help. I am injured, near death, and too weak to hike out of here. I am all alone, this is no joke. In the name of God, please remain to save me. He had been dead for roughly 2 weeks. His real name was Christopher Johnson McCandless. He was 24 years old. The discovery of McCandless's body ignited a fierce, polarizing debate across the Western world that endures to this day. To seasoned Alaskan outdoorsmen and pragmatic critics, Chris was a textbook example of reckless romanticism. An arrogant, underprepared suburban kid who marched into the unforgiving wilderness with a toy-like .22 caliber rifle and a 10-pound bag of rice, effectively committing suicide by hubris. Yet, to millions of young people around the world, he became a modern icon of freedom. A tragic hero who had the raw courage to break away from modern consumer culture in pursuit of an authentic existence. Before he erased his identity to become a ghost on the American highway, Christopher McCandless possessed everything the Western dream dictated as success. He grew up in an affluent, upper-middle-class neighborhood in Annandale, Virginia. His father, Walt McCandless, was a brilliant aerospace engineer who had done high-level radar consulting for NASA. His mother, Billy, helped run their highly lucrative tech consulting firm. Chris was a brilliant but fiercely nonconformist youth. He excelled in history and anthropology, served as a passionate columnist for the student paper, and graduated with honors from Emory University in Atlanta in May 1990. With his near-flawless academic record, the doors to Harvard Law School were wide open. His parents offered to buy him a brand-new luxury car and pay for his entire postgraduate education. To Chris, however, this gilded path was an existential prison. Deeply influenced by the transcendentalist philosophies of Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, alongside the gritty romanticism of Jack London and the asceticism of Leo Tolstoy, Chris viewed modern consumer culture as a profound moral corruption. He despised money and the hollow societal expectations that came with it. He refused the new car, choosing instead to drive a battered 1982 Datsun B210, lived in a stark room devoid of a phone or TV, and viewed completing college merely as a tedious obligation he had to fulfill for his parents before earning his absolute freedom. To understand the extremity of Chris's rejection of society, one must look at the dark undercurrents of his childhood. Behind the manicured lawns of the McCandless home lay a history of intense domestic volatility. Both Chris and his younger sister, Corrine, carried the emotional scars of witnessing their parents' explosive, toxic arguments. The breaking point occurred during the summer of 1888. While on a solo cross-country road trip to California, Chris uncovered a devastating family secret. When his father Walt had met and cohabited with Billy, he was still legally married to his first wife. Even after Chris was born, Walt had secretly maintained his first family, fathering another child with his ex-wife before finally obtaining a divorce. This discovery shattered Chris's universe. The authoritarian father who had strictly lectured his children on honesty, morality, and perfection was unmasked as a hypocrite living a double life. Chris felt that his entire childhood had been an elaborate lie. The respect he once held turned into a cold, calcified resentment. Instead of confronting his parents, he chose a path of passive-aggressive, absolute retaliation. He would let them believe everything was fine, play the part until graduation, and then vanish from their lives forever. In the summer of 1990, without a single word of farewell to his family, Chris executed his grand escape. He took his remaining law school savings of $24,000 and donated it in its entirety to Oxfam, a global anti-hunger charity. He packed a few clothes into his old Datsun and drove west, severing all ties. By July 1990, Chris had driven into the arid expanse of Arizona. He camped in Detrital Wash, a dry riverbed near Lake Mead, unaware of the sudden dangers of desert monsoon season. A flash flood roared through the wash, drowning his car. Although the engine was ruined, Chris chose not to call for help. Instead, he saw the disaster as an omen. It was time to strip away all remaining weight. He removed the car's license plates, buried his Winchester hunting rifle, and hid his camera. Then, in a defining act of symbolic defiance, he took his remaining paper money out of his wallet and burned it to ash on the desert sand. This was his ritual of purification, a literal burning of bridges with the monetary system. He discarded his Social Security card and reinvented himself as Alexander Supertramp. Christopher McCandless was dead. In his place stood an ascetic nomad, navigating the veins of the American continent on foot and by thumb. Chris took shelter in makeshift tents and traveled everywhere by hitchhiking. Whenever he set foot in a new place, he spent a long time pausing to feel and to listen to every breath of life around him. In August 1990, Chris left Northern California, embarking on a journey along the Pacific Crest Trail. Around that same time, his parents discovered they could no longer contact their son. Filled with anxiety, they hurriedly drove to Atlanta, hoping to find any trace of him. But upon arrival, they learned that Chris had checked out of his apartment 2 months prior. Later, with the assistance of the police, the car Chris abandoned was located. Inside, there were no signs of a struggle or altercation, allowing his mother to breathe a temporary sigh of relief. However, they soon realized that Chris seemingly did not want to be found. His disappearance was a deliberate choice. Yet, he believed that far-off Alaska held the cure to heal his inner emotional wounds. On his journey away from the Pacific Crest Range, Chris met a traveling couple, Rainey and January. They warmly introduced him to a peaceful sanctuary called Slab City, a place where life returned to its primitive state, far away from the chaotic hustle of the secular world. Jan promised that if Chris ever came there, she would gift him a special hat. But to a nomad like Chris, every encounter on the road was just a passing destiny. They happily spent a day together. Nevertheless, the next morning, Chris still quietly departed because he knew the Alaskan wilderness was still waiting for him. Chris continued to taste both the sweet and bitter flavors of his solitary journey. Even a picked-up apple became a source of simple happiness. He just kept on hitchhiking, with the rolling grasslands and the sunlight as his only companions. In September 1990, Alex hitchhiked into the small agricultural town of Carthage, South Dakota. There, he met Wayne Westerberg, a rough-edged but fiercely loyal man who owned a commercial grain elevator operation. Needing money to fund his eventual journey to Alaska, Alex took a job with Wayne. Alex proved to be the hardest worker Westerberg had ever seen. He never complained, taking on the dirtiest, most hazardous jobs in the grain elevator, from unblocking machinery to shoveling thick dust. Wayne grew to love Alex like a younger brother, sharing meals, drinks, and philosophy with him. Knowing that Chris was always heading toward the Alaskan wild, Wayne helped him acquire a hunting rifle and even invited an experienced hunter to teach him how to hunt and preserve meat. However, their camaraderie was cut short when Wayne was arrested for selling black market television descramblers. Before being taken away, he did not forget to remind Chris that he must wait until spring before heading north. But to Chris, the ranch without Wayne lost its vitality. With the operation shut down, Alex packed his backpack and hit the road once more. Chris entered Colorado. That night, a canoe suddenly caught his eye, instantly igniting the fire of adventure in his heart. He hid his belongings under a bridge, and the next morning, he immediately went to the management station to inquire about entering the water. To his surprise, the staff told him that obtaining a water permit required a waiting period of up to 12 years. But he refused to wait 12 years. He resolutely used all his savings to buy a kayak and plunged straight into the raging, churning torrents of the Colorado River. Chris casually met a drifting young couple. They deeply admired this solitary young man and invited him to come ashore to rest. They also pointed out a new route for Chris. Just by following the river downstream, he would reach the Gulf of California at Nidos. The entire stretch was over 300 kilometers long. Before they could talk for long, the patrol arrived, forcing Chris to leave immediately. He floated downstream, passing through the Hosu Bend section of the river and then conquering Hoover Dam. In December 1990, he arrived at the Sea of Cortez, living alongside whales and dolphins, and finally crossed the spillway of the Molos Dam to enter Mexico. He dragged his canoe across the desert and hitchhiked to the Guimas Gulf. He lived in a mountain cave for 36 days until a massive storm washed his boat out to sea. Left with no choice, Chris was forced to recalculate his route, turning back north toward the Mexican border. However, he possessed no identification documents, leaving him completely helpless before the strict border security. When night fell, his only option was to sneak onto a freight train heading back to California. At dawn, before the train even entered the station, Chris threw his backpack off. Following an abandoned drainage pipe, he quietly slipped into California. He secured a temporary bed at a homeless shelter in Los Angeles. Dropping his luggage, he hurriedly stepped outside to explore. However, the scene on the streets suffocated him. On the scarred, wounded roads, there were only lost souls wandering around. Through the glass windows of a restaurant, he saw well-dressed corporate men inside. Wasn't that the exact image he previously wanted to escape from? That forced, hollow smile triggered an overwhelming wave of revulsion and anxiety within Chris. Once again, he jumped onto a train to escape this concrete and steel cage. But this time, luck did not smile upon him. He was spotted by a railroad patrol officer, dragged down, and beaten to teach him a lesson he would never forget. Chris returned to the underpass, digging up the things he had buried earlier. For his dream of advancing to the north, to Alaska, he was sometimes forced to make a temporary truce with this world of concrete and steel. But deep down, he remained a wanderer who refused to be bound. During the year Chris went missing, the relationship between his parents underwent subtle changes. Every time his mother saw a disheveled wanderer on the street, she thought it was Chris, the son she longed for day and night. In December 1991, Alex found his way to the Slabs, a decommissioned Navy base in the California desert that had evolved into a lawless bohemian squatter community, a sanctuary for hippies, drifters, and social outcasts. Here, he reunited with Jan Burrs and her boyfriend Bob, the nomadic couple who had given him a ride a year prior. At the Slabs, Alex met Tracy Tatro, a beautiful, artistic 16-year-old singer-songwriter. Captivated by Alex's fierce intellect and rugged, poetic charm, Tracy fell deeply in love with him. They spent days walking through the desert sunset and painting their handprints onto the vibrant, eclectically decorated Salvation Mountain, a monument dedicated to universal love. Tracy pursued Alex with all the vulnerability and fire of youth, throwing open the door of her trailer to him. But Alex, exercising an almost monastic, stoic self-restraint, gently refused her advances. He cared for Tracy deeply, but his heart belonged exclusively to his Alaskan dream. He refused to sow the seeds of attachment or make promises he knew he would break, unwilling to inflict emotional damage on another person. He chose instead to channel their bond into music, performing beside Tracy on the makeshift stages of the Slabs. It was also at the Slabs that Jan Burrs opened up to Alex about the great tragedy of her life. Her own son, the same age as Alex, had walked out of her life years ago and vanished without a trace. Every time she looked at Alex's resourcefulness and radiant youth, she wept for her missing boy. When Jan's partner, Bob, looked into Alex's eyes and sighed, kids can be incredibly cruel to their parents. They have no idea how their disappearance completely destroys the people who love them. The words struck the rawest nerve of guilt in Alex's soul. He knew his parents in Virginia had hired private investigators and were living in a state of perpetual agony. Yet, his youthful pride and old resentments blinded him. He could only numb his guilt by hugging Jan tightly, accepting a blue woolen cap she had knitted for him, a maternal shield against the coming winter. In January 1992, near the hot springs of the Anza-Borrego Desert, Alex met Ronald Franz, an 81-year-old devout Christian and Army veteran. Ron's life was an abyss of unresolved grief. His wife and only son had been killed by a drunk driver in a horrific car accident in 1957. Devastated, Ron had drowned himself in whiskey for years before sobering up, isolating himself in a small apartment and practicing the solitary craft of leatherworking. Alex's arrival was like a lightning bolt shattering the old man's self-imposed tomb. A profound paternal instinct awoke within Ron. He took Alex into his home, fed him, and taught him the delicate art of leather tooling. It was in Ron's workshop that Alex carved the definitive map of his odyssey into a leather belt, etching icons of his submerged Datsun, the Hoover Dam, his Mexican kayak trip, and the capital letter N representing the North. Observing Alex's radical antisocial ideals, Ron asked him with paternal sorrow, "Son, what on earth are you running from?" Alex didn't answer directly, but instead used the incandescent energy of his youth to challenge the old man to break free from his routine. "You are wrong if you think joy only comes from human relationships. God's place is all around us. It is in everything and anything we might experience. You just have to change the way you look at things." The words of a 24-year-old drifter upended the 81-year-old's worldview. For the first time in decades, Ron closed his workshop, packed his belongings into a small truck, and climbed to the top of a desert mountain beside Alex, a feat he had never dared attempt alone. On February 22, 1992, while driving Alex to the railway station for his final trek north, Ron drove up the courage to make a devastating request. "My wife and my boy are gone. I have no one left in this world. If I were to adopt you, let you be my grandson or my son, would you accept?" The question paralyzed Alex. The fear of being tied down, of being claimed by another human being, overrode his affection. He deflected, saying, "We'll talk about this when I get back from Alaska, Ron." In April 1992, after 2 years of relentless movement, Alexander Supertramp finally crossed into Alaska. The last person to see him alive was Jim Gallion, a local Union truck driver who gave him a lift from Fairbanks to the head of the Stampede Trail on April 28th. Alarmed by Alex's shockingly light gear, no compass, no map, an inadequate .22 rifle, and a mere 10-pound bag of rice, Gallion practically begged him to accept his own waterproof rubber boots and a pair of gloves. Alex took the boots but stubbornly refused any further aid, confident in his self-styled asceticism. Alex hiked down the snow-covered trail under the shadow of Mount Denali. He waded through the icy, knee-deep waters of the Teclanica River, which was placid and easily fordable due to the winter freeze. On May 1st, after days of trekking through the boreal forest, he discovered Fairbanks Bus 142. It contained a rusted wood stove, a mattress, and some basic supplies left by hunters. Alex rejoiced, carving an ecstatic declaration of independence into the wood wall, christening it the Magic Bus. It was his ultimate fortress of absolute freedom. For the first 2 months, May and June, Alex lived in a state of spiritual euphoria. He successfully hunted ptarmigan, squirrels, and porcupines, and gathered wild berries. In the vast, silent expanse of the subarctic, far from the toxic ghosts of his parents and the synthetic noise of cities, he felt completely integrated with the natural world. However, as the short Alaskan summer peaked, nature unveiled its terrifying indifference. Game began to migrate, and food became dangerously scarce. On June 9th, Alex achieved a major hunting milestone. He shot a massive, 600-pound bull moose. Overjoyed, he planned to preserve the meat to sustain him for the rest of the summer. But summer heat brought waves of flies and maggots within hours. Alex attempted to smoke the meat over a greenwood fire based on techniques he had read about, but lacking real-world experience in humid summer conditions, the meat putrefied and became a writhing mass of maggots. He was forced to abandon the carcass to the wolves and ravens. Overwhelmed by intense guilt for taking a magnificent life in vain, Alex wrote in his journal, "I wish I had never shot the moose. One of the greatest tragedies of my life." Starvation slowly began to hollow out Alex's frame. During long, isolated nights reading by the bus and wood stove, he immersed himself in Leo Tolstoy's Family Happiness, a passage describing the ideal life: living for others, doing good, rural labor, and above all, a quiet life with a mate and children to share the beauty of the world, struck him like a lightning bolt. The spiritual revolution was complete. Alex had conquered the wild. He had purged the arrogant, solipsistic anger of his youth. He realized that absolute isolation was an existential dead end. He no longer hated his parents. He wanted to return home to hold his sister Corinne, to apologize to old Ron, to see Tracy and Jen. He opened his journal and penned the definitive truth of his 24 years on Earth. Happiness only real when shared. On July 3rd, Alex packed his heavy rucksack, cleaned bus 142, and began the long hike back toward the highway, eager to rejoin the human race. But the wilderness does not negotiate. When Alex reached the banks of the Teclanica River, the same river he had easily waded across 3 months prior, he was met with an apocalyptic sight. The summer heat had melted the massive glaciers high up in the Alaska Range, transforming the docile stream into a roaring, deep, and utterly impassable brown torrent of glacial meltwater. Because he lacked a topographical map, Alex had no way of knowing that just a mile upstream lay a historic tramway operated by a U.S. Geological Survey team, which could have carried him across the river in safety. Terrified by the churning rapids, he attempted to cross but lost his footing, nearly drowning before dragging himself back to the eastern bank, soaked and shivering. Defeated, he turned around and walked back to bus 142, hoping to wait out the summer until the river froze over once more. Back at the bus, Alex's physical decay accelerated. The leather belt he had carved with Ron now required new holes to be punched, cinching tightly around an entirely hollow stomach. On July 30th, driven by extreme hunger, Alex turned to a botanical guide, Tana Ina plant lore, to forage for wild potato roots, Hetesarum alpinum, a safe, edible tuber he had eaten before, but a catastrophic error occurred. As roots grew scarce, Alex harvested the seed pods of the plant. He was unaware that during the late summer, these seed pods are prone to an infestation by a toxic mold containing swainsonine, a lethal alkaloid. The poison did not kill him instantly. Instead, it paralyzed his digestive tract. It effectively blocked his body from absorbing nutrients from whatever food he consumed. He woke up the next morning experiencing profound lethargy and muscle weakness. Flipping through his book, he realized his fatal mistake. His body began to consume itself. He was ravenous, but no matter what he forced down his throat, it passed through him without providing sustenance. A terrifying despair settled over bus 142. In the final days of August 1992, knowing his end was near, Chris McCandless wrote a final farewell message on the back of a page of a book featuring a poem by Robinson Jeffers. "I have had a happy life and thank the Lord. Goodbye and may God bless all." He crawled into the blue sleeping bag his mother had sewn for him, resting his head against the mattress. He looked out the bus window at the pristine, fiercely beautiful Alaskan sky. In his final, hallucinatory moments of oxygen deprivation, the resentment faded. He saw an image of himself standing on the green lawns of Virginia, enveloped in the unconditional embrace of his mother and father. A single tear of profound peace slid down his gaunt cheek. Christopher McCandless closed his eyes, allowing his spirit to dissolve entirely into the wild. 10 months after Chris's body was recovered, Walt and Billy McCandless flew by helicopter to the Stampede Trail to step inside bus 142. Walt, the once stoic, domineering NASA scientist, collapsed onto the mattress, weeping uncontrollably for the brilliant son he had failed to understand. Billy left a small brass plaque on the bus door and a first aid kit filled with food and a note for future travelers. "Call your parents as soon as possible." The tragedy permanently shattered their old lives, forcing them to confront their own flaws and finally learn how to love each other without conditions. The story of Christopher McCandless is not a mere survival cautionary tale. nor is it a simple biography. It is a mirror held up to the face of modern Western society. Chris dared to live the dream to its absolute, bloody edge. He paid for his freedom with his life, but he left behind a profound question for the modern world. The specific way you live your life does not matter. What matters is whether you possess the courage to strip away what is false, the strength to walk away from a gilded cage, and the absolute freedom to author your own destiny. In the end, whether you view him as a reckless fool or an enlightened saint, Alexander Supertramp proved that our lives are defined entirely by our willingness to confront the raw, terrifying truth of our own souls.